Okay, thank you a lot for the introduction. So I want to present today our work on anonymous MultiHop Locks for blockchain scalability and interoperability. This is joint works of my colleagues Julia Malavolta, Pedro Moreno Sanchez, Aniket Kate, and Matteo Maffei. So, check. Okay, great. So the motivation for our work, actually the existing scalability problems that exist actually in all modern cryptocurrencies. In particular, for example, in Bitcoin, we can manage around 10 transactions per second, while, for example, Visa can deal with peaks of more than 10,000 transactions per second. So this is clearly hindering the right scale adoption of cryptocurrencies nowadays. So, and actually, there are mainly two lines of research tackling these problems, and actually one of these lines of research we've seen two talks before, which are so-called on-chain solutions, which want to tackle this problem on the consensus layer. So we also call these solutions layer 1 solutions. And then there's another track, so-called off-chain solutions. And most prominently, one solution approach here are payment channel networks. And this is also what I want to focus on today. So in particular, there are the prominent examples of the Lightning Network, which is payment channel network implemented for Bitcoin, and also the Wader network, which is implemented in Ethereum. And the main contributions of our work that I want to present today is actually a novel security attack on payment channel networks, in particular also the Lightning Network. Then I want to show how we actually solved this problem by inventing a new cryptographic primitive for the underlying locking mechanism that is used in payment channel networks. And then we show how actually we can instantiate this primitive in a fashion such that it is efficient, that it is compatible with Bitcoin and actually all other cryptocurrencies, and also got by now actually adopted by the Lightning Network. And finally, we can also show how with this primitive for the first time we can, or with instantiations for this primitive, we can get actually cross-currency payment channels and payment channel networks. So I want to start with a short background on payment channels and payment channel networks in general. And so to first give the overall idea of what a payment channel actually is, you see here a scenario where we're having two parties, Alice and Bob. Actually, Alice now wants to perform payments to Bob, but these should be fast payments that are done off-chain. And to be able to do so, Alice will first deposit a certain amount of money. In this case here, this will be 5 Bitcoin, that she can then use in the future for these fast off-chain payments. And she deposits this money by actually making a transaction on a blockchain, transferring these 5 coins to a multi-sig contract. So this means that after this transaction was published on a blockchain, this money can only be spent with signatures of both Alice and Bob. And to make sure that actually Bob can now not block just Alice coins forever, there is a time lock, and so this just means that after a certain time, actually Alice will just get her money back. So how can now transactions be made? So the idea is that actually now Alice can just prepare a transaction that actually redistributes what she has deposited by just transferring part of it to Bob, here for example 1 Bitcoin, and then she signs this transaction and gives it to Bob. So now Bob is having a guarantee that whenever he's going with this transaction to the blockchain before the timeout, that he will for sure get his money. But of course, he should not directly go to the blockchain, but rather wait whether maybe Alice wants to transfer more money. For example, she could later send a transaction that looks like that, actually transferring 2 Bitcoins to Bob. So this would actually be way more beneficial for Bob now to claim on the blockchain. So actually, only shortly before the timeout, Bob should now actually put the last transaction that he got to the blockchain, and like this closing the payment channel and actually manifesting this final distribution on the blockchain. So now that we have seen that, of course the question is whether we really want all participants in the network now to have these payment channels, because this means that all of them need to deposit with a lot of other parties' money. And okay, the idea that came up is that of course we would rather like maybe to have networks of such payment channels so that people can make payments along a path. So that actually when we are now having the scenario of having Alice that wants to pay a Bitcoin to Carol, and they're both sharing a payment channel with Bob, then we want to be able that actually just Alice can do a transfer to Bob, and Bob is then forwarding this payment to Carol. But of course, when we're doing that, we should be careful that Bob is not just running away with the money. So we somehow need to ensure that this happens atomically. And if we want to make sure that this happens, then actually why should Bob participate in that at all? And for this, we actually will Bob give a small fee that is then provided by the sender, Alice, so that Bob is having an incentive to participate. So this is the high-level idea of what payment channels look like. And now, of course, it's interesting how this can be realized in practice. For example, in Bitcoin's Lightning Network. And the general idea in the Lightning Network is that actually when you're performing multi-hop payments, so that the money is not directly transferred as in a normal payment channel, as you've seen it here, as it was before, but that actually money on the payment channel is just locked by doing such a transaction that actually cannot just be published on a blockchain, but needs the knowledge of a certain secret key, that is X here, to open actually now this lock, which is having the condition Y. And additionally, we'll also add a timeout, so actually this locking will not be valid forever, so that actually this amount of money cannot forever be locked on the payment channel. And more precisely, what this kind of lock will look like is that it is a so-called hashtime lock contract. So this means that actually the secret or the key is a value X, which is the pre-image of this condition Y for some hash function H. And so now, of course, we ask ourselves, how can we actually now use such HTLCs to actually get a multi-hop payment? And this can actually now easily be done by having several phases in our payment. So first of all, Carol will come up with such a condition by producing the hash of the secret that only now she knows, and will send it to Alice. And now Alice will, instead of directly transferring money to Bob, will just lock the money in her payment channel with Bob, with such an HTLC, and Bob will do the same with Carol. Now Carol knows that everything along the path is actually blocked, and she can actually release the secret to claim the money, so pull the money from Bob. By this, Bob is now learning the secret and can himself actually claim the money from Alice. And here it's now very important that we are a bit careful with the times. That's the reason why we also introduced these timeouts here, is that actually the timeouts need to decrease so that actually after Bob learned the secret from Carol, Bob is still having enough time to actually claim his money also from Alice, so that he's not losing anything. So, okay, the idea looks very nice, but we're of course interested in like what's the state of security and privacy in that construction. And okay, so we are having two main questions. So first of all, are these off-chain payments, as we've seen them, secure? Because it seems that intermediate users cannot lose money. The second question is whether they are privacy preserving, because intuitively, off-chain payments should give us more privacy, because at least not every single transaction is published on a blockchain. And okay, we would not have a paper on that if the answer would be yes, so the answer is clearly no. And I want to show you actually what's the issue with that. So first of all, we found this new attack on the security of payment channel networks, and especially also the Lightning Network. And we call it a Wormhole Attack because the idea is that actually an attacker can steal now the fees of honest users by just bypassing him or bypassing them in the payment. So when we look at the situation that you can see here, we are having a path from Alice to Carol, and there are two participants that are actually controlled by the attacker, E1 and E2. And we are having the setup that actually the payment was started in an honest fashion, so all of the amounts that should be transferred are locked. So we're now actually, when the lock should be released, Carol will start by sending the secret to E2. And now E2, instead of pulling his money from B, will just directly forward the secret to E1, who can then in turn actually claim the money from Alice. So Bob actually didn't notice at all that this payment happened. So only after the timeout, the money will be released again, and Bob would just consider the payment to be failed. But what happened now is that actually, when we consider what was earned by the attacker who controls E1 and E2, actually E1 got 1.3 bitcoins, and E2 only needed to pay 1 bitcoin, so in total they earned 0.3 bitcoins, which are actually their own fees, 0.2, plus the fees of Bob. And as you can imagine, the longer this path are, the more between the attackers, the more the attacker can earn. And also, of course, all incentive for Bob is actually gone now to participate as intermediary in this payment channel network at all. So this is a very big issue. And the next thing that we also that's also a problem is that actually we are also having a problem with privacy. And so just because not every transaction is published on a blockchain, still participants that are on the payment path can actually learn something about the transactions. Intuitively, we would like to have the security notion that actually an on-path adversary cannot distinguish two concurrent payments that are ongoing. But when we have a look at the construction of the HTLC, then we are having this condition that is the same over the whole path. So this means it's acting actually as a unique identifier of a payment. So when we're having an on-path adversary, he can easily distinguish the two payments by looking at the conditions, which differ. So now, of course, we try to come up with a solution for that, and first want to give the intuition of the overall solution, because the interesting thing actually is that we found out that both the security and the privacy issue that we found are having a common source. Namely, these are these conditions that are the same along the path. So our idea for solving this issue on a high level is to change these conditions to be randomized. So, and for doing so, we actually need to introduce an initial setup phase where the sender is distributing randomization factors to all of the intermediate users. And the guarantees that we now want to get from this are, first of all, atomicity, which actually means that no intermediate user should lose coins, and this is ensured by the fact that actually as soon as a user's right lock is opened, he can also open his left lock, so also pull the money. Then we want to have consistency, which should prevent a wormhole attack, which means that actually user cannot open his left lock unless his right lock was opened before. And finally, we want to have relationship anonymity, which means that actually no user on the path should learn anything about the other participants on the path rather than his direct neighbors that he anyway needs to communicate with. So how we solve this is that we actually came up with a cryptographic primitives that we call anonymous MultiHop Locks. And to capture the security and privacy guarantees that we want to get, we actually formalized an ideal functionality describing exactly this behavior that we want to achieve. And then we came up with 3 different constructions that we then proved to realize this ideal functionality. And we did this in the universal composability framework, which allows us then to use this primitive to actually build broader applications such as payment channel networks from this primitive. And due to the lack of time, I unfortunately cannot show you all of these constructions, but would refer you to our paper if you're interested in that. But I will focus on the ECDSA-based construction, which is particularly interesting because it is based on a signature scheme and is compatible with Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a lot of other cryptocurrencies. So the general idea of ECDSA-based locks is actually are so-called scriptless scripts. The idea of a scriptless script was first introduced actually by Andrew Polstra, and the idea is that actually you can encode actually a condition within a signature, which is very nice because we anyway have it to sign signatures in general. So this means that now when we have a look how we can use this idea of actually encoding a condition within a signature, how this looks like for our payment channel, then we actually need to change the setup a bit. So before we actually, for depositing money, Alice transferred this money to a multi-sig contract. But now actually it will be transferred to a shared identity between Alice and Bob. So this hypothetical shared identity is just an identity which is having a secret key that is shared between Alice and Bob. And the idea actually is now that for spending now such a the deposited money of Alice, one of course needs to actually produce a signature that is signed by this shared identity. And it should be actually not be fully signed, but signed up to this secret K. So that now when Bob learns the secret key K, he can actually complete the signature and is getting this guarantee again as in the payment channel as we've seen before that he can claim the coins in case that he needs. So of course this is now not totally trivial anymore that this can be easily done because of course Alice needs to have enough knowledge to produce such a half signature that is only lacking the key, and also Bob needs to be able to actually check that what he gets is such a valid half signature so that he has the guarantee that with the knowledge of the key he could in principle complete the signature. So before going a bit more into detail how we do this, I actually want to show how we can now use this idea of getting our secure and privacy-preserving payment channels or payment channel networks, so multi-hub payments. And as I've already said at the beginning, the intuitive idea is that we're now having a setup phase where actually Alice will distribute some information for all of the intermediate users that they can use when producing actually the locks. And this is, first of all, like a random key share that they will get, and also the conditions that they should actually use now on each of the hubs. And so I think it gets more clear when we have a look on how now actually locks can be released again. And the idea is that initially Carol actually got already the key for her condition, which is now really the sum over all of the key shares along the path. So she can now directly release her lock with E2. And by learning this information, because E2 is having the key share K4, he can just subtract this key share and by this learns his valid key for his lock with Bob. And this can go on actually until the whole path is unlocked. Okay, this means now even if E1 would have all knowledge of E2, he could not unlock this. So, and we're getting exactly the properties that we would like to have, namely that actually these conditions look random now and we cannot have a wormhole attack. So just very shortly on how this now works with ECDSA, I don't want to go too much into detail, but the general idea is that actually ECDSA is a signature scheme based on elliptic curve cryptography. So this means that a signature is formulated with respect to a random point on an elliptic curve. So and for signing, we then actually used the randomness that that was used for getting this point. We're using the secret key, and we're using the message that we want to sign, which in this case is the transaction. So for getting now a shared signature, we of course need to use shared randomness and a shared secret key. For encoding a condition, we can simply encode this condition, like the secret and the randomness itself. And now actually for getting such a half signature, we just remove actually this key again from the secret, but still having the signature with respect to the original random point on the elliptic curve. And now, of course, the challenges of how to compute this. And this is unfortunately a bit complicated. It needs some extra cryptographic means because ECDSA is unfortunately having a very ugly structure. So this is unfortunately getting a bit technical, but if you're interested in that, please check out our paper there. We're giving this algorithm in detail and explain of how we can do this for ECDSA, even though the structure of ECDSA is really not really suitable for that. So what we get, of course, is that we're having now security and privacy because we proved that. We are compatible with Bitcoin, who's using ECDSA signatures, and this whole approach got implemented in the Lightning Network. We reduce the transaction size because we directly encode our conditions in the signature and don't need any special scripts for that. And also settlement transactions now look completely indistinguishable actually from normal transactions in Bitcoin. And also, this construction turned out to be very practical in both communication and computation. And another very nice result that we achieved is that we can now build with that actually cross-currency payment channels and payment channel networks, because even when we're having, for example, two parties having a payment channel in Bitcoin using an ECDSA-based construction, and then two parties having a payment channel in another cryptocurrency like Ethereum, which is using another construction, which is based, for example, on a discrete logarithm, we could still build a payment channel along these. So to sum up, we have seen the Wormhole Attack, which is an attack on the security of payment channel networks. We've shown how we can come up with a primitive and security definitions that actually prevent these security and also privacy issues. And then we show concrete constructions that are efficient, that can be implemented and are implemented in Bitcoin's Lightning Network, and that also enable intercurrency payment channel networks. Thank you a lot.
Hello, Zach Smith, University of Luxembourg. Hi, great paper. I've already read it. I love it. Could you go back to the slide where you show the protocol with the K1 plus K2 and all of that?
Sure. Sorry, there are some animations going on here.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So my only question is, does your attacker model assume that the endpoint, or in this case A in particular, is honest?
I mean, it doesn't really make sense for A in this setting not to be honest, right? Because then just the payment would fail. If any of the intermediate users would not have the information for like that he needs for releasing, there will just be a timeout, the payment will fail, and hence Alice will not be able to make the payment. So, but we're assuming then that Alice, therefore, I mean, needs to be honest, but would need to have the incentive to be honest.
Okay, thank you.